Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is New Jersey's plan for achieving 100% carbon neutral electricity. This webinar is being presented by the Clean Energy States Alliance on behalf of the 100% Clean Energy Collaborative. We have a number of excellent guest speakers with us today. Before I pass it over to them, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. All of our attendees for this webinar are in listen-only mode. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of today's webinar. You can connect via computer, mic, and speakers, or you can call in via telephone. If you'd like to minimize your webinar console so that you can view the presentation full screen, you can click on the orange arrow that you see circled, and you can also click on that arrow to expand your webinar console. And one of the things that you might like to do with your webinar console is submit questions. We encourage you to submit your questions and comments throughout the webinar. We will be saving some time following our presentation for a Q&A with the webinar speakers, so please do type your questions in when you think of them. A final note, this webinar is being recorded. We will send you an email within about 48 hours with a link to the webinar slides and a recording. And we'll also be posting all of those webinar materials on CISA's website at cisa.org/webinars. So with that, I would like to pass it over now to our host for today's webinar, Warren Leon. Warren is the Executive Director of the Clean Energy States Alliance. Warren?
Hey, thanks very much, Samantha. Let me first tell you something about the Clean Energy States Alliance, or CISA. We're a national membership organization composed of public agencies across the country. We have members in about 20 states, and you could see logos of our various members right up here on your screen. And one of our activities, if we can go to the next slide, of the Clean Energy States Alliance, is the 100% Clean Energy Collaborative. This is a relatively new initiative where we're working with states that have adopted 100% clean energy goals for their electricity sector or are considering adopting 100% clean energy goals for their electricity sector. And we're doing a variety of meetings with those states. We're doing a newsletter. We're doing broader outreach on various topics. And one of the things we are especially interested in doing is letting states know about states that have put together 100% clean energy plans, what's in those plans, and how the plans were put together, because knowing about those plans and how they were developed can help other states figure out how they can develop and implement their own plans. And so today we are fortunate to be focusing on New Jersey, which has developed and published a very interesting and important plan. And we're going to be hearing about it from three of the people up there on your screen. And let me introduce them before turning this webinar over to them. First, we're going to hear from Hannah Thonet, who's the Senior Policy Advisor at the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities, which is the state energy regulator. In that role, she helped drive New Jersey's energy and climate policy, including increasing the state's portfolio of renewable energy and energy efficiency, accelerating end-use electrification, and incorporating economic development and equity into state policies. She's the chief architect of the 2019 Energy Master Plan, which we're all going to learn about today. Previously, she served as chief of staff at the New York City Department of Environmental Protection, where she co-chaired the department's participation in the city's sustainability plan. She holds an MPA in environmental science and policy from Columbia University. We're also going to hear from Chaz Teplin, who works on clean energy economics, regional decarbonization planning, transmission, and grid modernization at Rocky Mountain Institute. He co-authored RMI's recent report on the growing market for clean energy portfolios, and he led RMI's contribution to New Jersey's plan modeling least cost decarbonization pathways. Before joining RMI, Dr. Teplin was a photovoltaic materials scientist at the National Renewable Energy Lab and also worked at Terralux, an LED lighting startup. He has a PhD in physics from the University of Colorado at Boulder. And finally, we're going to hear from Jeremy Hargreaves, who's a principal at Evolved Energy Research. He specializes in energy systems analysis, focusing on least cost electricity system planning and distributed energy resource evaluation. His consulting insights into long-term grid scale and distributed resource planning challenges have helped decision makers navigate the prospect of a high renewable future while minimizing impact to consumers. His portfolio of domestic and international work contains many examples where he's leveraged impactful analysis to inform policy development. His education includes a PhD focused on energy systems optimization and a master's in environmental management and economics, both from Johns Hopkins. So let me turn it over to them.
Hi, this is Hannah Thonet. As Warren just said, I'm the Senior Policy Advisor at the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities. First of all, just to say hello and thank you for joining us, and thank you, Warren and the Clean Energy States Alliance, for inviting us to speak today. I am joined here with my colleagues Chaz Teplin from Rocky Mountain Institute and Jeremy Hargreaves from Evolved Energy Research, who were critical partners in helping us to develop the modeling that supported the Energy Master Plan. So just a brief run of show. I'm going to start with some key takeaways that I hope you'll be sort of thinking about as we go through our presentation. Then I'll do a brief intro to the Energy Master Plan and add some context. Then Jeremy and Chaz are going to take over and talk about the modeling process. And then I will take it back to discuss developing the Energy Master Plan and finally the implementation. So as we go through this, I'd like you to think about what this means for your own state and your organization and your own priorities and what actions you can take to make progress on pursuing a clean energy agenda. I hope that you come away from this today getting a sense of what a decarbonized energy system looks like. The economics behind a transition to a clean energy economy is really quite low, and frankly lower than we thought it would be, and has a host of other benefits, including significant public health benefits, which sometimes gets overshadowed in the conversation about climate change. The importance of getting started and moving quickly. The longer we wait, the harder and more expensive this becomes. Identifying and pursuing your own top priorities and what investments or changes in policy and regulation give you the biggest bang for your buck. And finally, acknowledging just the absolute crazy that has been 2020, obviously COVID-19, but also the upcoming federal election, the increasing divergence between state energy and climate goals and federal regulations. We are currently trying to sort of manage what the outcome of the MOPR, the minimum offer price rule. And finally, I think real attention to equity and environmental justice. So as we recognize that we're trying to accomplish these industry shifting changes amidst vast uncertainty and disruption, allow me to first just add some context and history to New Jersey's Energy Master Plan, or I'll probably frequently refer to it as EMP. First, in May of 2018, Governor Murphy issued Executive Order 28, directing the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities to convene an interagency team to develop the Energy Master Plan, and to include in that plan a roadmap to reach 100% clean energy by 2050. So this is the first time that New Jersey was asked to adopt this kind of plan. That same day, the Clean Energy Act of 2018 was also enacted, and this added several mandates, including an increase to our RPS to 50% by 2030, and additional goals including offshore wind mandates, a change in our solar program, adopting an energy efficiency resource standard, and new storage goals. New Jersey also, a year later, became a signatory to the multi-state zero-emission vehicle MOU, which commits us to meeting specific milestones for putting EVs on the road. In addition, Governor Murphy recommitted New Jersey to meeting its emissions reduction goals as laid out in the 2009 Global Warming Response Act, which commits the state to reducing emissions 80% relative to 2006 levels by 2050, also known as 80 by 50. New Jersey is also a member of the US Climate Alliance. And third, we needed to consider and account for how this plan would grow the economy and support and include all New Jersey families and businesses. A stronger and fairer New Jersey is one of Governor Murphy's key platforms. And so the EMP is built on these three pillars. Critical to success was being able to model and really put numbers and data behind what it would take to reach the goals of 100% clean energy and the 80 by 50 emissions reductions. So we put out a competitive RFP to do a 30-year modeling of our entire energy system, which we called the Integrated Energy Plan, or IEP. And Rocky Mountain Institute and Evolved Energy Research won the bid. The EMP launched with initial stakeholder engagement in the fall of 2018 and continued throughout the process of the draft EMP, the development and modeling of the IEP, and the final Energy Master Plan, which was released on January 27th, 2020. Briefly, I'm going to review New Jersey's estimated greenhouse gas emissions so you get a sense of where we were starting from. This is 2018 data, which is our most recent available, and it comes from our state DEP. So you can see the transportation sector is by far the greatest source of our emissions, followed by electricity generation and commercial, industrial, and residential buildings. And if you aggregate the building sector by combining commercial, industrial, and residential, the building sector actually overtakes the electricity sector as the second largest source of emissions at 31.8 MMTs of carbon dioxide equivalent. Our total net emissions that year were about 97 MMTs, and we need to reduce that number to 24 MMTs by 2050 to meet our 80 by 50 mandate. So to figure out how we were going to do all this, we worked with RMI and Evolve to establish a model. I'm going to pass the mic over to Chaz and Jeremy to walk through that.
Thanks, Hannah. So in supporting the plan with modeling, we really were asking the question, what is the best future we can envision for the state? And that word best there is quite hard to define because it's going to be a balance of different and often competing objectives. Things like equity, cost, reliability, jobs are all important factors in coming up with a plan for New Jersey. And so we developed least cost pathways that examine different priorities developed with the stakeholders. The right-hand side of this slide here is showing some of the things that we looked at. In terms of policies, we looked at different levels of transportation electrification, different levels of building electrification, whether we could build new gas, whether we could extend nuclear. And we also looked at uncertainties as well, where there are things that could happen to New Jersey in the course of decarbonizing the economy over the next 30 years that might change the types of investment, might change the least cost pathway or the best pathway to get to decarbonization goals. They included regional coordination, what level of coordination exists in the future, regional emissions policy. So what are the states around New Jersey doing in terms of reducing their own emissions? And then what are the cost projections? You know, we're basing our plan on forecasted costs, forecasted technology availability over time. And what if those look different from our understanding today? So by looking at these different pathways, we were able to start to understand the trade-offs between different ways that the state could go to reach their goals. Look at how much does one pathway cost versus another. And this provides additional information for policymakers and stakeholders to evaluate the types of choices that they need to make near term. And then developing this long-term look into the future and how we might reach the decarbonization goals, that provides a target for near-term policy and action design. To do the modeling work, we used decarbonization modeling tools, RIO and Pathways, developed by Evolved Energy Research and used by a number of states for their planning efforts. And these are designed specifically really to answer this question and incorporate a lot of features that allow us to come up with realistic pathways to decarbonization and realistic options really evaluate the full set or full spectrum of solutions that might help us get there. Next slide. So the modeling work complements policy development. It informs near-term decisions in the long-term context. And if we think about why we're doing the modeling in a plan in 2019 or 2020, it's really to inform those decisions that we make right now in the next year, in the next 3 years, and thinking about how the model interfaces with that policy development process. We can identify common elements deployed in the next decade, those so-called no regrets types of decisions that get us closer to that sort of target best scenario in the future. Part of that is thinking about replacing or avoiding long-lived resources. You know, there are things that if we build them today, they're definitely still going to be around in 30 or 40 years time. And do we want those investments in the future? So that's one of the things that having that long-term context allows us to evaluate. Similarly, in things like demand-side infrastructure with long lifetimes, industrial boilers being a good example, we only have 1 or 2 bites of the apple of replacing that kind of equipment when it burns out. And so thinking about what types of demand-side program we want in place is also part of that. Early action on long lead time or hard to achieve energy transformations. We know that there are things that take a long time to put in place. Transmission on the infrastructure side is a good example. Typically or frequently we see 10-year lead times to new transmission and a lot of hurdles to overcome along the way. So if we want that, and we know that we need that in the future, we need to start thinking about how do we get that early on. And then other things such as markets, rates, things that may be useful to facilitate the evolution or the transformation of the economy towards these low carbon goals. There's a lot of inertia there as well. And so we need to think about what transformations we want and start that process now in order to be able to get them in the future. And the last point I'll make there is that this is not prescriptive. We're not trying to model every investment that needs to be made from now to 2050 and follow that exactly. There's an understanding that by using the best public cost and technology projections now, we're putting our best foot forward on the near-term decisions. With the understanding that in the future we'll be updating that plan. And so we'll revisit these types of decisions when more is known further down the road. And this is complementary to policy design because with the modeling, we're determining the cost of infrastructure and fuels, the types of nuts and bolts decisions that we might make to get to our decarbonized future. And the policy is determining who pays for them. So by doing the modeling and starting at basically the end and working backwards, our 80 by 50 targets, 100% clean, we're asking where do we want to go? And then policy starting now and working forwards, answering that question, how do we get there? So I'll pass it off to Chaz to talk through some of the key modeling takeaways that we found.
Thanks, Jeremy. Great, so I'll take the next 2 slides and just share like some of the top line results before passing it on to Jeremy to get into more of the details about how a decarbonized New Jersey can evolve. But if you don't remember anything else from modeling, I hope you'll remember these 4 points. The first is that New Jersey can meet its emissions targets with technologies that exist today or are very much on track to be available in time. So it's worth noting that this is new, right? Like the costs of wind and solar and storage and EVs, as everybody knows, have come down, and also heat pumps. And these now can be deployed today at basically the same or lower cost often as legacy technologies. So that's the number 1 takeaway, I guess, is that New Jersey can absolutely meet its emissions targets. The technology is there. The cost also is small, smaller than the direct health benefits, not including things like a social cost of carbon. And so New Jersey can overall have a net benefit from making this transition, as you'll see on the next slide. Third, a decarbonized system, though, looks extremely different from today's. So while these new technologies are all similar, sometimes lower, sometimes a little bit more cost, pure economics alone is unlikely to drive the transition at the speed that New Jersey needs in order to meet its goals. And that leads to the last point, which is that existing policies are insufficient. Because of the scale and the speed of the transition required, new policies are indeed needed in the state. As I just said, the lower costs are unlikely to make the transition happen fast enough, though of course they make the transition easier. Next slide. So what did the analysis find on costs? Basically, it found that costs are small compared to total energy system spending. So when we think about energy system spending, this isn't just what is my utility bill, it's also what do I spend on gasoline, what is the energy that the businesses that I rely on need to use and spend money on, and also what is the infrastructure I need to do when I purchase a car. In some sense, that's an energy spending, and so we need to include what's the difference in cost when I buy an EV instead of a standard car. And so we show what that looks like in 2050 in the graph on the left. So you see that we need to spend a lot more energy. That's the orange bar. So we have to spend a lot more than we would have otherwise spent on certain things. But on the other hand, we also avoid a lot of costs, and most of those costs are the cost of fossil fuels that we no longer have to purchase. And you can see that there's a small difference there, a few billion dollars over the course of the whole state. And I'll put that number in context. But then you can also look at what are the direct clean air health benefits, and those are estimated just basically from the American Lung Association estimates on the reductions in particulate matter in the air. And then if you were to also add in a social cost of carbon, you can see a total net benefit that's positive for New Jersey. So how does total energy system costs compare to GDP in either a reference scenario or a scenario where we meet the state's goals? And those are shown in the orange and the green lines on the right. Historically, energy spending has been quite volatile, actually, largely due to fluctuations in fossil fuel prices. Of course, fossil fuel prices are low today, but there's no guarantee of what that will look like going forward. If we use those projections, though, we see that energy costs as a fraction of GDP are expected to decrease regardless of whether the state transitions, and that they might be a little bit more, the green line, than the orange line if the state does make the transition. And as we go through the presentation, I hope and maybe in the questions, we can talk about why those costs show up and what the uncertainty in them might lie, and why we might be optimistic that actually making the transition would be lower cost overall. With that, I'll turn back to Jeremy for the next few slides.
Thanks, Chaz. So the next few slides, we're diving into sectors in the economy and how the sectors change over time as we get to those 80 by 50 and clean energy goals by 2050. So on the right-hand side of this chart, looking at electricity here first, it shows final energy demand for the entire economy. So starting in 2020, that's how much electricity, pipeline gas, gasoline, diesel, and other fuels we are consuming to power every part of the economy. As we move forward in time to 2050, we can see the evolution of how that fuel use changes. We're electrifying a large component of transportation, so gasoline is going away. Pipeline gas is reducing as we're electrifying other end uses in the economy. And as a result of that, we're replacing it with electricity, and we see a significant growth in electricity through 2050, about a doubling of final energy demand for electricity. And that doubling is met by an increase in the generating capacity in the state of about 3.5 times. And that's shown on the bottom chart there, where by the time we get to 2050, the majority of the capacity in the state is, or about half of it, is coming from solar. The nuclear fleet is extended, and that's shown in the red portion of the bottom chart there. And on top of what that capacity is providing in terms of energy in the state, we're also importing a significant amount of clean energy from out of state, and that's mostly wind energy. We're retaining the existing gas fleet, but we use it a lot less. You see there's still that gray block in 2050, but that's providing a reliability service with very low capacity factors. And then offshore wind and energy storage are above the mandated builds for those currently. So we have 7.5 gigawatts of offshore wind mandated by 2035. We see 11 gigawatts as economic in the model by 2050. And then storage likewise is exceeding the current mandates and expanding to 9 gigawatts in 2050. Next slide. Focusing on transportation, the last internal combustion light duty vehicle is sold in 2035 in our modeling assumptions. So everything sold beyond then in the light duty fleet is electric. Medium and heavy duty vehicles are also electrifying to a lesser extent, medium 75% by 2050, heavy duty vehicles 50%. And the remaining transportation fuel use is shown there on the right-hand side. It's reducing significantly. We tested a scenario where we had lower adoption of EVs, and that increased our costs by about 4.4 billion annually by the time we got to 2050. And about 40% of the vehicle fuel had to come from expensive clean fuels. You know, we were leaving more primary fuel use in the economy, and in order to get to the 80 by 50 target, we needed to decarbonize some of that, and that primarily came from biofuels. Next slide.
Jeremy, before you leave the transportation, do you want to just chat briefly about the role of the cost of batteries and EVs and the uncertainty in the cost analysis?
Sure, yeah. So one of the important uncertainties that goes into the total cost that Chaz presented earlier comes from the cost of fuels and the cost of EVs. The cost of EVs being the sort of principal or first primary component of the uncertainty in costs. And if we were to decrease the costs of EVs or the forecasted costs of EVs by just 10%, then that would push us into net benefit territory. Even before we factor in those externalities of health benefits and carbon, it would just be cheaper from an infrastructure and fuels perspective to decarbonize the economy. And so it's very sensitive to the price of EVs. That's one of the largest expenditures. A car is one of the most expensive things that people buy. And I think we have good reason to believe that costs will come down over the forecasted prices that we used in the New Jersey analysis. Every year, the forecasted prices for EVs seem to be lower. So we could be optimistic that the cost of decarbonizing the state is lower than what we've projected in the analysis. Moving on to buildings, the key takeaway here is that electrification is an extremely effective form of efficiency. So by electrifying end uses in buildings, we are reducing the total final energy required in the economy. And the right-hand side chart there shows by the dashed black line what our least cost case final energy demand was with a lot of electrification in buildings. If we don't have any of that electrification, the final energy demand is higher, and that's shown by the colored bars there. It's about an 18% reduction to electrify those end uses based on the assumptions we have in the model. And if buildings retain fossil use, then other sectors have to make up the difference to meet the goals. And so we need to be decarbonizing in other ways in order to make up for that lost efficiency. The challenge there is that we have less leeway. You know, everything has to go right in other sectors to be able to reach that level of decarbonization. And if we were to push beyond 80 by 50 and say update our target to 100% at some time in the future, it makes it difficult to get those further reductions because there's a lot of stock involved in gas consumption, gas boilers, gas water heaters, gas furnaces, etc., that need to roll over time. Early replacement is very expensive, and so getting started early, particularly if we know we need to go to even more stringent targets in the future, is a cost-effective strategy. And I'll pass it back to Chaz to discuss the fossil gas use in buildings and electricity.
Thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, just building on, this slide makes a lot of the same points that we made in the last one, but we know that the use of natural or fossil gas in buildings and in electricity is a really, potent issue in today's conversation. So, we just wanted to make it clear, like the least cost scenario does call for a continuous decrease in the use of fossil gas. It's found to be least cost overall. And as Jeremy mentioned, there's in the case of buildings, if we electrify, like the electricity that supplies those, that supplies the heating that those buildings are currently, relying on fossil gas for, there's a number of ways to provide that electricity. Whereas if we retain the gas use in those buildings, the options are pretty limited. And the low carbon replacements for fossil gas are expensive and of limited supply. And so that's why we find. It's also worth noting that though we renamed it here pipeline gas in this chart, which is the existing gas fleet that's used for electricity generation. Like that's an interesting piece of the puzzle for New Jersey. That fleet of gas generation is extremely valuable in the near term for balancing renewable output, and conceivably could be converted into something that could use a zero or low carbon gas like hydrogen or a synthetic or biofuel. And so it probably doesn't make sense to shut down, according to the analysis, those gas plants in the near term. And in fact, the model shows that it might actually be worthwhile building them or another clean, firm, dispatchable technology in the sort of 2035 timeframe. But between now and then, it most makes sense to hold on to that gas fleet, but build wind and solar so that the gas fleet's used less and less. Next slide. So sadly, the GIF is cut off a little bit at the bottom, but I think that the message is clear, right? That near-term action and there's an absolute need for speed in the energy transition, and that's because to meet these goals, the economy needs to transition and transform pretty radically. And so the sooner we act, the more time we have to make that transition, and of course, the faster we start reducing emissions. Today, there's a lot of actions that modeling both here and in other decarbonization analysis shows are least costs. And those include beginning the long timeline investments, such as in both the physical and the human infrastructure. So what I mean here is things like transmission and distribution take a long time to plan and build. We need to get started on those right away. Market structures, Hannah mentioned earlier, and then things like EV infrastructure. Obviously, we also need to start deploying large amounts of wind and solar, which will be the primary energy sources in a clean future. We should be really careful. This is certainly true in what we found in New Jersey, but it generally is true found in throughout the country in similar studies, that before deploying new fossil infrastructure, especially if we expect that infrastructure to be used extensively in order to pay for itself. And then accelerate both the EV transition and building electrification. Those are both technologies that are going to take time to take over the consumer purchases. And the sooner we can begin making that transition, the more likely it is that we are to succeed. And then lastly, I guess I encourage us not to spend too much time talking about how we're going to maintain reliability with the last 10% of electricity emissions. It's an important problem and a little bit academic though today. We need to start thinking about what technologies are going to be available to retain electricity reliability when it's not windy or sunny for extended periods. But we're not going to need to be making the investments in the next couple years. So we certainly should not let those conversations slow the deployment of wind and solar today. But one thing we also do find is that it also may not make sense to retire the gas fleet as long as we continue using it less in order to continue to meet the decarbonization goals that we're hoping for. Great. With that, I think I'll turn it back over to Hannah.
Thanks, Chaz. So this chart shows anticipated emissions by fuel type in 2050, assuming we were to follow the least cost scenario. That horizontal dotted line represents our emission reduction target. So you can see we can actually exceed our target by 2050. And the two sloping dotted lines at the top represent two base cases. The upper line is a true business as usual case, and the second is what would be a business as usual case incorporating the clean energy executive and legislative mandates I mentioned earlier. And so you can see that the actions taken or mandated to take in New Jersey thus far are quite promising, but they also peter out in the late 2020s, suggesting that we will ultimately need to do more. So towards the top of the presentation, Jeremy discussed how the modeling is about establishing where you want to be in 2050 and working backwards. It's my job to look at where we are today and work forwards with the goal of reaching that end state and determine what actions we can and should prioritize today to move us onto this pathway identified in the modeling. And of course, it's more than just looking at the data, vital as it is, and is absolutely vital, but the model, it doesn't tell us anything. As regulators and policymakers, we also need to consider equity and environmental justice. We need to consider job growth and economic development. So in developing the Energy Master Plan, we used the IEP to inform and help prioritize actions with respect to timing, pace, and scale, but we had to establish what those actions should be. Now, I'm about to put a lot of words on the screen, so let's start here and just discuss general themes. The Energy Master Plan is a 290-page comprehensive roadmap that lays out 7 strategies to dramatically lower New Jersey's carbon emissions and reach Governor Murphy's mandate of 100% clean energy by 2050. And I'll note here that many of the goals are not within the jurisdiction of the Board of Public Utilities, but will need action by, as examples, the DEP, Department of Transportation, our Transit Authority, the Buildings Department, in some cases, the legislature. So it's really sort of an all-in effort from the state perspective. Now, if I were to summarize the entirety of the Energy Master Plan into a few bullets, it would be decarbonize the transportation and building sectors to the greatest extent possible, often through electrification, decarbonize the electricity sector by ramping up carbon-free energy resources, reduce that energy demand through energy efficiency, through building codes, land use changes, improvements in mass transit, though I know that's really hard to say today in the middle of COVID, and the reduction of vehicle miles traveled, and notably end-use electrification, because end-use electrification is, under most circumstances, more energy efficient than burning fossil fuels for the same end use. And building a modern, dynamic, flexible, responsive grid to handle all of this increased load and renewable energy. And the final thing is to put people first and to use this transition to bring in new jobs and new industries, to reform the existing regulatory structures to lower electricity costs, and to increase focus on low and moderate income households and dedicate funding streams to help them participate in and benefit from this energy transition. So I promised lots of words, here they are, the official 7 strategies of the Energy Master Plan. There are roughly 10 to 15 goals in each strategy. So I'm not going to read them, but first we focus on transportation. So not only the light, medium, and heavy duty vehicles, and including action items like leading by example in transitioning the government fleet and building out the charging infrastructure, but also we address vehicle miles traveled and emissions at the ports and airports. Strategy 2 is about reaching 100% clean energy, increasing and accelerating deployment of renewable energy, financing that deployment, and determining how to reform regulatory structures to reflect and enable more renewable energy at lower cost. Strategy 3, it's well documented that energy efficiency is the most cost-effective measure we can take to lower costs and reduce energy demand. which in turn reduces climate emissions and criteria air pollutants. So one element of the strategy is to reduce aggregate energy use, and the other is to reduce peak demand. And the third element addresses building codes, energy labeling, and appliance standards. Strategy 4 addresses decarbonization of the building sector. This will be one of our most challenging sectors to address. Like most of this country, New Jersey is largely built out, but it's critically important. So we prioritize new construction and homes using electric resistance heating, as well as homes heated with propane and fuel oil. And that is purely for economic reasons from New Jersey. I know that the economics of other states are quite different. Strategy 5 addresses the grids and pipelines. If we're going to successfully increase end-use electrification and rely predominantly on renewable energy, we need to plan for, build, and finance a modern grid that can handle the technology of today and tomorrow. And we need to empower customers to better understand and manage their energy demand and to build systems that respond to price signals. Critically, we also need to determine how to manage what may over time become an underutilized gas distribution system. Those first 5 strategies are specific to the energy sector in some way. The last 2 strategies are the embodiment of a stronger and fair New Jersey. Strategy 6 is about bringing these 5 strategies to the local level for implementation, with a particular focus on enabling low and moderate income households and environmental justice communities to take part in these opportunities and reduce barriers to entry. And the 7th strategy reflects economic and labor and workforce development, bringing in new jobs in industries, investing in R&D, creating new financing opportunities, and investing in workers. And that's for both younger workers who can train in clean energy opportunities, and also retraining as necessary for established workers who may see stagnating job opportunities before they reach retirement. So the real question is the Energy Master Plan a guidebook or a paperweight? This graph shows what our I'm sure this chart shows what our 2050 electric supply should look like. Represents about 94% carbon-free electricity. I assure you our electric generation today looks nothing like this. It's about 5% solar, and the rest is primarily nuclear, natural gas. But we are making a lot of headway, bolstered definitely by a supportive executive and legislative branch. Now, just briefly, because I know we're trying to wrap up so we can open to questions. New Jersey has an offshore wind target of 7,500 megawatts by 2035. It was increased from a previous target of 3,500 megawatts by 2030. We awarded our first solicitation for 1,100 megawatts last spring, and we expect that to begin operations in 2024. And just in the last couple of weeks, we've also released both a draft strategic plan for offshore wind, as well as our draft second solicitation guidance document. So we will be soliciting for anywhere from 1,200 to 2,400 megawatts this coming fall. And in addition, as I mentioned, it's very much a partnership. Some of our sister agencies are also working on developing the ports and building the industry to support offshore wind as a new industry in New Jersey and on the East Coast. On solar, to meet our EMP modeling targets, New Jersey needs to add about 950 megawatts of solar per year. To give you some context, in our legacy program, we built about 3 gigawatts total, and we've averaged 320 megawatts annually in the last few years. So we need to triple our solar build out starting now. That's not an easy lift, but we are committed to it. New Jersey is in the middle of a solar transition, and we'll be launching a new solar program this winter. And we also have to remain under a legislative cost cap. So that goes back to balancing how you do that build out while also ensuring that you're protecting the ratepayers. And again, where we are also trying to carve out space to ensure that we're being equitable and inclusive, we also launched a community solar pilot program. The first year just happened, we awarded 78 megawatts, still in the pilot status. They are all serving majority low and moderate income households. We'll be opening up our second year this fall, and we'll have a permanent program in place by February of 2022. Energy efficiency needs no introduction, clearly necessary to meet New Jersey's clean energy goals. It's the cheapest and easiest tool in our clean energy toolbox. And also just hugely important to deploy this first to reduce consumption and appropriately target other renewable energy efforts so we don't overbuild or overspend. So in the last couple months, we did just adopt, the board adopted our very first energy efficiency resource standards of 2.15% for electric and 1.1% for gas savings as required by the Clean Energy Act of 2018. Those programs will begin next summer. And again, we had additional focus on issues of equity and delivery of programs to low and moderate income communities, local workforce development, and ensuring supplier diversity. And we have active working groups on these topics to ensure that we stay focused here. And finally, most amazingly, the most number of words on a page, and yet this is one of our newest endeavors, is really spearheading electric vehicles. As I mentioned, we are a signatory to the multi-state ZEV MOU. We had committed 330,000 EVs to put on the road by, oh, I'm sorry, that's actually a typo. That should be 2025, not 2050. But also most recently, we said 30% of our medium and heavy duty ZEV sales by 2030 and 100% by 2050. And what was really interesting is that this past January, our legislature stepped up and codified that commitment and created additional milestones as well to put 2 million registered vehicles on the road by 2035 and to have 85% of new sales or leases by 2040, plus additional commitments, as you mentioned, to the state and leading by example. So there are goals for our transit authority buses, for our charging infrastructure build out, and for the state fleet as well. We have grants going on to study how we can increase EV access in urban areas and underserved communities. And we've also dedicated our RGGI funds to transportation electrification, particularly medium and heavy duty vehicles in underserved communities, so we can really work on tackling the air pollution. And and at the end, leading by example, EVs are now included in the state purchasing contract. We also have new grant programs for local government fleet. And my own agency, BPU, we just released a straw proposal, I think last May, to set minimum utility filing guidelines to expedite charging infrastructure build out. So there's just really a lot going on in this space. And ultimately, as we wrap up, what comes next? The world has changed a lot since January. In addition to everything I've just talked about, we have proceedings on in FRR. We're looking at natural gas capacity. We have funding to roll out a study on building electrification. We're looking we're involved in a program with RMI to explore clean energy standards. There's just a huge amount going on. And I think it all comes down to, what are those next steps? And I would just say to try to plan for success, know where you're trying to go. And recognizing, considering as an example, our EV law, it sets really aggressive targets, far more aggressive than we would have normally come to. And yet, if you look at the modeling and data, even those aggressive targets aren't fast enough. But it's something, it's a start. And the more I think we can all put out those goals and start working towards achieving them, the faster the cost declines will come as we all start, reaching these goals at scale. And again, I would say, putting in prioritizing environmental justice and equity. It's just vitally important that this energy transition enable everyone to participate in and benefit from clean energy. And finally, I'll welcome Chaz and Jeremy to pop in with any final thoughts as well. But I'd say, a national policy that helps to support our goals would be vitally important as we are all, working on our own respective priorities. Chaz or Jeremy, do you want to pop in? Or should we open to questions?
I advocate going right to questions if they come through, unless Jeremy has something to add. I thought you did a great job.
No, I agree. Let's go to questions.
All right.
Good. This is Warren. Thanks very much. You've done a lot of impressive, important work there. Unsurprisingly, there are a bunch of questions. The first two I want to ask are about the relative contributions of different things in the plan. When you talk about the fact that electricity demand will be increasing, what's the relative impact of transportation electrification versus building electrification and increasing electricity demand?
Transportation is a larger contributor, but I wouldn't be able to give you exact proportions without looking up some more data on it.
And the other thing I guess I would add to that, they're both significant. Both the building electrification and the transportation are both meaningful. A key thing that we didn't show, but is that actually New Jersey's peak electricity demand shifts to the winter, and that's of course largely due to the use of electricity for heating buildings.
Okay, and Then you also show total electricity demand decreasing over time, and you talked about the significant efficiency benefits of building electrification. In terms of the decrease in electricity use, how does building electrification compare to other energy efficiency measures that might be implemented over time?
So there's a package of things going on here. In the slide that question is referring to, there are still underlying efficiency improvements in the building technologies. Electrification is just not happening in that case. And so in all of our scenarios, we are including New Jersey's relatively aggressive levels of efficiency gains just from improvements in the technology. So that's a factor in reducing the final energy demand as well. And then adding in the electrification on top of that, then we see some significant increases in efficiency, just because, you know, heat pumps are a lot more efficient than their equivalent AC units or water heaters or space heaters.
And I just wanted to make sure that like people didn't have the wrong misconception. Like total electricity use increases dramatically, but total energy use goes down. So total electricity goes up, but total energy goes down, and that's because yeah, okay.
Good. And when you talked about, go on.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, and also just to be clear, like the model assumes aggressive electrification and aggressive efficiency. So what does that mean? It means that we assume that, for example, building insulation, when it's time to, you know, redo that in the stock rollover model, it assumes that people make the building envelope more efficient. As an example, it assumes that they use LED light bulbs, but it also assumes electrification. So those two complement and compound on one another for savings.
Okay, when you talked about heat pumps early on, were you talking about air source heat pumps or ground source heat pumps?
It's air source for the most part, but we have different options depending on what technology it is. I won't be able to give you the exact types of technology that are being used, but they're from established databases for the particular climate zones that New Jersey falls into.
Okay. And because the operating licenses of New Jersey's nuclear plants are going to end before 2050, and the region's nuclear plants, are you assuming that those plants will be retired or will be replaced or somehow extended?
So we gave the model the option of extending the nuclear power, and that was using some generic costs developed by EPA for what extension might look like, and the model chooses to do that. And so you can see that in our capacity results that the nuclear power is still there in 2050. And so it is cost effective as part of the solution, given the costs that we assumed to use nuclear through to 2050 and the 80 by 50 goal. Good.
And was carbon pricing considered as an economy-wide low-cost solution to getting towards clean energy?
So carbon pricing is a potential solution for driving a lot of the change that's happening here. The model itself doesn't model those specific policies because it's looking at an emissions target. And so whereas the model is determining what types of infrastructure are necessary and cheapest to get to an 80 by 50 goal, complementary to that is policy to achieve that. And a carbon pricing policy is one of the policies and potentially part of a package of policies that could achieve that goal in the future. And New Jersey is part of a pricing regime right now, and it can be expanded potentially, and that's something that can be discussed as a package of policies in the future. Maybe Hannah, you have more to add on that.
Sure. No, I think you explained it pretty well, because the model would not include the policy mechanism to achieve the goal. It's saying if you are going to achieve that goal, what you need to do it. And then it's up on the state to establish what are those mechanisms to achieve that. So certainly a carbon tax is one of those tools, but that would not be built into the model. That would come, again, using the model to inform policy decisions, such as what can you do to enable this decrease in emissions.
Okay, Hannah, I believe it was you who was talking about the increase needed in the rate of solar deployment. New Jersey's already done a lot with solar. You're talking about doing this at a pace 3 times greater than what's been happening up till now. Was there any consideration made of the potential land use impacts of doing that much solar development and the potential difficulty in finding sufficient sites to do that much solar development?
Yes, we definitely did. And we did bring into that conversation, in terms of what the model could even accept, a solar siting analysis that looked at what our potential was. And going into that policy call then is, well, where do you site it? And certainly we have a priority for rooftops because of that. We are a small state, and again, very developed. So we actually do have pretty vital farmland. So we're not really looking to turn over our farmland into solar development. But we did include a solar siting analysis to ensure that we didn't overbuild what was actually feasible, both from a technical or a policy perspective, and we embedded that into the model. But we are in the middle of a huge overhaul in our legacy solar program. We closed our program at the end of April. We're currently in a transition program, and we're developing a successor right now. So solar siting will be a vital part of the conversation that we'll be having with stakeholders in the next few months.
And what are you assuming will need to be done in the near term and medium term to advance energy storage, to have sufficient energy storage to meet some of the needs of the electricity system?
I think realistically, energy storage will become more and more vitally important as more renewables come onto the grid. At this point, we're only about 5% solar, and so we have really more than enough natural gas and nuclear to serve as balancing. And Jeremy and Chaz, feel free to jump in as to that trigger point. But I think we have we are mandated to put 2 gigawatts of storage into the grid by 2030, and I think that target sounds about right to me.
Maybe I'll just add that the model just assumed, used the standard projections for improvements in the costs and capability of lithium-ion based storage. So nothing, no new long duration storage technologies were assumed to come online. If those technologies did arise, then the model would likely pick them. Well, depending on the cost, of course, but they would be another option for the providing reliability during periods where there's very little wind or solar, and which for the model now assumes that we would use the gas fleet fueled by biogas. But it would be good to have additional options for that eventuality.
Well, I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'll give our 3 speakers an opportunity to say anything else they want to leave with the audience with as famous last words. But the last question I'll ask is, look, you're dealing with a long time period. Some of the solar panels and wind turbines in the region have been up for a while already. When doing this model, did you account for the fact that you would have to replace before 2050 some of the existing solar and wind infrastructure?
Yeah, so all of the infrastructure that is existing already in 2020 is represented as such in the model, with a lifetime that has already elapsed somewhat. And so at some point during the next 30 years, those facilities are going to roll off as they come to the end of their lifetimes. And the model can choose to basically replace them with the updated vintage of technology that's available in that year. So we're forecasting technology improvements based on NREL databases, and there'll be an investment cost associated with replacing panels with the, say, it retires in 2030, the 2030 version of solar at that time. And so we don't think, or we don't assume those technologies are going to be there forever. Everything has a lifetime, and it rolls off and gets replaced if that's the cost-effective thing to do.
Hey, thanks very much to all of you. Do any of you have any last thoughts you would like to leave with our audience?
I think my final thought is really just that in trying to establish what those priorities and those early investments should be, that we're, I think, really focused on building out the renewable infrastructure. We're looking at how to do so more affordably for ratepayers. You know, right now we sort of have our traditional energy, and then we're paying additional money for RECs. And I think trying to establish sort of the next generation of really how we should be paying for all of these things and developing them, and to really look at what has long lifespans of sunk costs that may become stranded assets in the future.
I'll let Jeremy go last and so go second. You know, my recommendations would be, you know, all of the decarbonization analysis, including this one, has shown, you know, a couple of key things. They are, you know, build lots of wind and solar. It's almost going to be impossible for us to build too much wind and solar in the near term, and so we need to figure out how to make that happen. So whatever it is that we can do to make that happen, it will probably save money. And then second is figure out how to accelerate electrification, especially for vehicles today, and start understanding how we can start electrifying buildings quickly.
Yeah, I think that I will somewhat echo both Chaz and Hannah's comments in that one of the key components of reaching a cost-effective decarbonized future is to reduce our total energy use. If you look at the results from the other cases that we have in New Jersey, it becomes more expensive to decarbonize your system when you need to build more wind, more solar, consume more fuels because you still have high energy use. And so electrification is a key component of reaching those goals in the future. And electrification of transportation in particular, how fast can we do that is a key question. And what are the hurdles that we need to overcome to get there? And so to echo Hannah's point, there are a number of things that we know we need to do, and a lot of those are happening 2030 and beyond, but we need to get started on them now. And so prioritizing those in our planning processes is key to getting to these cost-effective solutions in the future.
Hey, thanks very much. You all gave excellent presentations and answered a wide range of questions. I think you've given us a good sense of both the opportunity to move towards clean energy in a state like New Jersey and given us a good sense of what the challenges are. I think what you've done in your report is a good model of what other states can do as they think about how to move forward towards 100% clean energy. I want to thank everybody for coming today, and I'll leave everyone with a slide. If we can go to the next slide, one after that, showing some other upcoming webinars that folks may want to listen to. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you.